لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. Welcome you back to our course on Ibn Hajar's Nukhbat al-Fikar, our level 2 al Hadith course towards understanding core concept in Hadith theory. Alhamdulillah, we've been on a bit of a break for the summer period. It's a scheduled break for the Northern Hemisphere at least. And we continue with the same course objectives and outcomes that we commenced with. And that is number one, to understand Hadith and its role in Islam. And for the most part, we've covered this in the first half of the course. Walillahi alhamd. Number two, which is our second primary focus, it is to master the standard Hadith terminology, which we find ourselves right in the midst thereof at present. And then number three, also something that we've covered in the first half of the course, and we will also try to look at some more aspects towards the latter end of the course, bi'idhnillah. It is understanding Hadith preservation, transmission, and authentication. This is also an ongoing discussion, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. This lesson, putting things back into perspective, bi'idhnillah, we look at a brief mustalah revision. So as opposed to revising everything from the very beginning again, that is unique to the first half of the course. The second half, focusing predominantly on mustalah al-hadith at the beginning, we commence firstly with a revision of what we've covered so far as the nomenclature of the muhaddithun is concerned. Number two, we look at problems with transmitters. That's the primary lesson that we're dealing with here. Problems with transmitters, we said you can either have a ta'an, you can have a discrepancy in the sanad, and you can have a discrepancy in the rawi. So we will analyze that further bi'idhnillah. And then we zoom into one of the problems with transmitters, especially in relation to their precision, and that is mukhalafa, right? Specifically contradicting reliable transmitters. So that's what we have to look forward to in this dars bi'idhnillah. Let us commence with the first part of the dars, which is a brief revision of the concept of the nomenclature of the muhaddithun, or mustalah al-hadith, as a form of revision bi'idhnillah. For this, we refer to our shajaratu al-tawdihiyyatu li anwa' al-hadith, basically a mind map of the categories of hadith. The first two categories Ibn Hajar mentions a little later on, so after the discussion on weak ahadith, so we skip that for now. Then we commenced from bihasbi tariqati wusulihi ilayna, right? How did the hadith reach us? With a focus on adadu turuqihi, the number of pathways. When a hadith has innumerable pathways, it is referred to as mutawatir, or massively transmitted, sometimes known as canonical. For the most part, the overwhelming majority of ahadith are of the ahad category, meaning it doesn't quite reach tawatur. However, you have different forms where there is at least 3 transmitters in every link or at every stage. That's mashhur. At least 2 transmitters at every stage. That's aziz. Or at least 1 transmitter at every stage. Right? At least is the key word there, because of course it can be more at other stages. So that's ahad, and we spoke about the relative probative nature of the ahad and the type of evidence that it forms. It's important that we understand mutawatir is qat'iyyu thubut, and that means it's 100% authentic. Qat'iyyu dalala is a different story, right? The hadith can either be dhanniyyu dalala or it can be qat'iyyu dalala. It can be absolute in its clarity, or it can be probable in its clarity. That's a separate discussion under usul al-fiqh and interpretation. But when it comes to ahadith, because with the thubut we are looking at dhanniyu thubut, therefore ahadith as a whole generally falls under dhanniyu dalala. Can it be dhanniyu thubut, and it can be qat'iyyu dalala, or it can be dhanniyu dalala. So in terms of authentication, the overwhelming majority of ahadith, because they are ahad, they are dhanni in terms of its authenticity. And that's not the problem. That means that on the scale of authenticity, you're going to range from 99%, cannot be 100 because that's only mutawatir, and all the way down to let's say, as an estimation, because we're imagining the scale, it goes down to about 70%. That would form your Sahih category. From beneath 70 till about 51, you're looking at your Hasan category. From 50 down to about 25, you're looking at your weak category. And below 25, you're looking at extreme weakness, and all the way down to 0, where it's mawdu' or fabricated, that is completely unreliable. So that's an important scale to just keep in the back of one's mind. We can go through that again, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, but the idea therein is to demonstrate the probative nature of ahad and mutawatir and other forms of hadith. We proceed, inshallah. We then discussed bihasbi surat al-i'tibar. We looked at supportive evidence, because supportive evidence, whether it is a tabi' or shahid, different types of supportive evidence, it is extremely important to understand that concept when we're looking at authentication, which we'll do in a moment. Then some of our longer discussions, still on this page, we looked at bihasbi al-qabul wal-radd, categories of whether the hadith is going to be accepted, maqbool, or mardud, rejected. So firstly, we looked at maqbool, what type of ahadith are accepted. We then discussed the concept of sahih, right, when a hadith is authentic, but sahih li dhatihi, meaning it is intrinsically authentic. It requires no supportive evidence in order to render it authentic. It is authentic by itself. Then we looked at a category beneath that, where at least one narrator, instead of having tamul dabt, he has khafiful dabt. This thus makes the hadith hasan, right, hasan li dhatihi, because there's a discrepancy in the standard of dabt. Not that there's a lack of dabt, but it is not as perfect as the sahih category. However, a hasan hadith plus another hasan hadith with a different link can be raised in status to sahih li ghayrihi, right? Because the two weakest links would lend support to one another. Similarly, when a hadith doesn't match the criteria for hasan, in other words, it is weak, but there are other weak hadith that add evidence to it, so they have supportive evidence, the mutabi' and the shawahid, supportive evidence that lends support to the hadith, then a weak hadith can become hasan li ghayrihi, hasan due to supportive evidence. So this we all covered in the first half, walillahi alhamd. Then we looked at situations bi'atibari al-amal bihi, wherein we have to consider which ahadith do we practice upon and which do we not practice upon. So for example, there may be contradictions within certain narrations, and when there are no contradictions, we categorize that as muhkam. It's absolute, it's categorical, there's no need to discuss it further. It can already be admissible as evidence. But sometimes there are contradictions, and then scholars need to apply a system of resolving these apparent contradictions. And that system, as we discussed in our lessons, is that they start off with jam', trying to incorporate the purport of all of the relevant narrations and practice upon them all by synthesizing the narrations. If that is not possible, or rather if that is possible, then this is referred to as the category of mukhtaliful hadith, right? Mukhtaliful hadith is an entire category. There are books written about it, like Ibn Qutayba's renowned work. If you cannot make a sort of synthesis between the narrations and they cannot coexist, in other words, they are mutually exclusive, then we proceed to the next form of resolving the contradiction, which is naskh, abrogation. An abrogation can only take place if there is evidence of dates, right? That one particular incident occurred at this time and the other incident occurred earlier or later. Thus you are able to determine the abrogator, the nasikh, and the abrogated, the mansukh. So that's what we have here. In terms of practice, you do not practice on the abrogated, even though the narration may be authentic, but you don't practice upon it. Why? Because it's abrogated. And in terms of what you do practice upon, naturally, that which has no contradictions, or that which the contradictions were resolved, whether it be through jam' or whether it be through abrogation, and then you would obviously practice upon the abrogator, that which came later. Again, this is what we covered in the first half of the course, walillahil hamd. In terms of rejection, we started with this as well, and we first looked at the broad categories of shadh, because we said in the Sahih definition, a hadith must be from a thiqa, so somebody with tamud dabt and adala, tamud dabt and adala. The sanad itself must be muttasil, it must be connected or contiguous from the beginning till the end, and there must be no hidden defects, mu'al, nor any contradictions with that which is more authentic, shadh. So those two components at the end, we briefly mentioned that. We'll show some further categories of that inshallah, or subcategories, but the shadh is a reason for rejection, and hidden weakness, illah is the singular and ilal is the plural, that's another reason for rejection. But as far as reasons for what makes the hadith weak at various levels, it's either going to be lisaqat fi sanadi, a drop or discrepancy in the chain of transmission, or lita'ni fi rawi, or there's a discrepancy with the transmitter themselves. We have covered in detail when there's a drop or a discrepancy in the chain. The discrepancy could either be saqtun zahirun, an apparent discrepancy, or saqtun khafiyun, a hidden discrepancy. An apparent discrepancy is when you can easily detect there's a problem with the chain because it is mu'allaq, it's suspended at the level of the sahabi, it's munqati', it is severed or cut off at the level of the tabi'i, it is mu'dal, there are two consecutive missing links. Munqati' also refers to when there are disjointed missing links, so missing links somewhere in the chain, not necessarily consecutive. Mursal is when a tabi'i transmits directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then of course there's the saqat khafi, a hidden discrepancy in the chain, such as mudallas, when obfuscation takes place. And we've explained this before, and it's a bit too in-depth to just give a brief explanation, but obfuscation, for those who have gone through it and understood it, it means that somebody transmits from someone that they did in fact hear hadith from, or they did meet, or they did transmit, but they transmit that which they didn't hear. And then of course there's mursal khafi, which is a type of mudallas, it's a type of obfuscation, where the person transmits from someone that they could have met and they could have transmitted from, but they never met them, they never transmitted from them, but they claim to transmit from them by adding their narration. So that's a form of mursal khafi. Again, that was a oversimplified explanation. Refer to the lessons of the first term and you'll find the detailed explanation there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that category was the weakness, lisaqti fi sanadi, a discrepancy in the chain of transmission, and the two types of discrepancies, and then we dealt with each one. Now what we've kept for this term, we've dealt with some of them, and we will cover the rest in the following two lessons bi'idhnillah, is a discrepancy in the transmitter. When you have a problem with the transmitter of the hadith, it's either going to be min jihatil adala, a problem with his integrity, or min jihatil dabt, a problem with his precision. Now, while we can broadly outline it like that, Ibn Hajar doesn't necessarily separate between the two, but rather what Ibn Hajar does is he mentions them in order of their seriousness. So the most serious defect first, and then the less, and then the less, and then the less, until he covers all of the reasons for weakness. What we have covered is the first few, and then there are some details that we need to look at beyond that. So let's see where we are at the moment, bi'idhnillah, in our revision. So we are looking at bihasbil qabuli wa rad, the category of acceptance and rejection of ahadith. In terms of which ahadith are accepted, right? When there are no contradictions, muhkam, these are sahih, hasan, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li ghayrihi. Those are all under muhkam. When there are contradictions, if they can be resolved through jam', it's mukhtaliful hadith. If it cannot be resolved through jam', it goes over to naskh when there's the necessary evidence, in which case you practice on the nasikh, you don't practice on the mansukh. And if they cannot find any evidence for naskh, the scholar would make tarjih. This is the job of the faqih, And there are several reasons for that, explored in the books of Usul al-Fiqh. And if they cannot make tarjih for any reason, which is probably very rare, if not impossible, then theoretically they would make tawakkuf, where they don't practice on either of the transmissions. As for the rejected category, our current exploration, we looked at as-saqtu fi sanadi, right, a drop in the chain or discrepancy in the chain. And now we are busy with at-ta'nu fi rawi, a discrepancy in the transmitter, which can either be due to adamul adala, a problem with his integrity, or adamul dabd, a problem with his accuracy or precision. Looking at these categories, when there's a problem with adala, it means that the rawi is a liar, or is accused of lying, or he is a fasiq, he's an open sinner, or is unknown, jahala, which we'll explore, I think, in the next lesson, bi'idhnillah, or is guilty of a sin in relation to his belief. So he's guilty of heterodoxy, right? Which is, in Arabic, we call this bid'ah. And here we are not speaking about bid'ah as in practices, but more so about innovations in belief. In terms of discrepancies of his accuracy or precision, either he makes a lot of mistakes, like major mistakes, or he's careless in his transmission, or he has wahm, he has doubt in the way that he transmits. He says he either said this or he said that, or is guilty of mukhalafa, which is contradicting those who are more authentic or more in number. Now this one requires some exploration, which we'll do in this lesson bi'idhnillah. So in essence, what I'm saying is that for these reasons, we've covered some of them. We've covered, for example, lying, being accused of lying, fisq. We are now going to look at, we've also covered major mistakes, carelessness and wahm. We are going to focus in this lesson on mukhalafa. And then in the next lesson, we look at jahala and bid'ah and poor memory bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Why are we only focusing on mukhalafa in this lesson? Because there's quite a bit to unpack about mukhalafatul rawi lil-thiqat. To contextualize this again, let's look at the notes from Nuzhatun Nazar, Ibn Hajar's commentary on the Nukhbat al-Fikar, from the edition by Shaykh Nuruddin Itar, rahimahullah ta'ala, wherein the author states, أسباب الطعن في الراوي, the causes of a discrepancy in the transmitter, ثم الطعن, a discrepancy, يكون بعشرة أشياء, can be because of 10 things, 10 factors. بعضها أشد في القدح من بعض. Some of them are more severe in being a point of criticism من بعض than others. So some are more serious than others. خمسة منها تتعلق بالعدالة. 5 of these factors are connected with the problem, or rather connected with a problem with the person's integrity. وخمسة تتعلق بالضبط. 5 of these factors are pertaining to the transmitter's accuracy or precision. ولم يحصل الاعتناء بتمييز أحد القسمين من الآخر. Ibn Hajar, in listing these, he did not distinguish between these 2 problems as different categories. Like he didn't list all of the issues with adala and then all of the issues with dabt. Instead, he did a different format, and the author says, لِمَصْلَحَةٍ اقْتَضَتْ ذَلِكَ, because of a different higher purpose. وَهِيَ, what is that? تَرْتِيبُهَا عَلَى الْأَشَدِّ فَالْأَشَدِّ. He wanted to arrange them according to the order of severity, with the most severe being listed first, and that is when somebody is a liar or a fabricator. And then from there, they get lighter and lighter. في موجب الرد على سبيل التدلي, in order to see what must be rejected with priority. لأن الطعن, because a discrepancy, a problem, إما أن يكون, it can either be لكذب الراوي, because the narrator lied, في الحديث النبوي, in hadith transmission, بأن يروي عنه صلى الله عليه وسلم ما لم يقله متعمدا لذلك, such that the person deliberately says that the Prophet ﷺ says something, knowing that it is a lie. That's the most serious. أو تهمته بذلك. The second one that Ibn Hajar mentions is تهمة بالكذب, right? Being accused of lies. بأن لا يروى ذلك الحديث إلا من جهته, such that there are transmissions, there are hadith that are not known except from this particular person. ويكون مخالفا للقواعد المعلومة, and his transmissions are contradicting well-known and well-established principles of Islam. وكذا, and similarly, من عرف بالكذب, somebody who is renowned as a liar, في كلامه, in his speech, meaning his daily speech with people, وإن لم يظهر عنه, وإن لم يظهر, even though it has not yet become apparent, منه, from him, وقوع ذلك, the occurrence of lies, في الحديث النبوي, in his prophetic hadith transmission. وهذا دون الأول, being accused of lying is less than being guilty of lying. The third category he mentioned was أو فحش غلطه أو كثرته, a transmitter making major mistakes or making abundant mistakes, where his mistakes are found to be outweighing his accuracies. أو غفلته عن الإتقان, or he is heedless about being precise in his transmissions. He doesn't observe accuracy. أو فسقه. Now, okay, let's pause here. These points, right? How does Ibn Hajar and other scholars like him, muhaddithun, how would you and I even determine whether the transmitters in the books that we read are guilty of these things? Now, due to development, and this is a discussion that we'll have later on, we can now refer to the books of Ibn Hajar and the books of Imam al-Dhahabi and other scholars, and then rely on their assessments of these transmitters. And that's generally what scholars would do, and that would be the first entry point for the student in the world of ilm al-rijal or kutub al-rijal. You would look at Taqrib al-Tahdhib, for example, and just check the narrator's name if he's in the Sihah Sitta, find his categorization, is a thiqa or is a saduq or something of the sort, and accept that as being accurate. And that's fine. But the question I want you to think about also is, so how did Ibn Hajar and how did Imam Dhahabi come up with these categorizations? How did they know that so-and-so is a thiqa or so-and-so is a saduq? What was that process? The best exploration of this process, firstly, the process is called mu'arada or muqarana, which is to corroborate the transmitters and to corroborate the transmissions. The best explanation or academic discourse within classical literature would be that of Imam Muslim's introduction to the Sahih Muslim, or Kitab al-Tamyiz as he called it, along with the muqaddimah written to that by Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, Shaykh, I forget the authors, it's going to come to me in a moment inshallah, but Manhaj al-Naqd عند المحدثين. You have two Manhaj al-Naqd books, as to my knowledge. One is by Shaykh Nuruddin Itar, which is Manhaj al-Naqd fi Ulum al-Hadith. And then Dr. Mustafa A'zami, who's the author of the other one, Manhaj al-Naqd عند المحدثين, he actually criticized Dr. Nuruddin Itar for utilizing this name, because Manhaj al-Naqd, like the actual meaning of this phrase, the methodology of criticism, is referring specifically to the process of muqarana, mu'arada, this process of corroboration, as Dr. Jonathan Brown also explains in his book on hadith. So what's important for us as students is to understand that there is a process beyond the process that we are currently busy with. And that's really my point. Even though this may be an introduction to Mustalah al-Hadith, understand that we don't just make these things up as we go along, like saying so-and-so is a liar or so-and-so is accused of lying. Sometimes it's based on biographical reports by well-renowned and established scholars. Like if Shaykh Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah ta'ala, makes a claim about a particular narrator that he was a liar, he did this, he did that, then that's going to be a form of evidence for us. It's going to leave an impact for us. But for the most part, when it comes to their precision, did they make mistakes, a lot of mistakes, a little mistakes? Did their mistakes outweigh their accuracies? Did their accuracies outweigh their mistakes, etc.? This is something that we can determine by comparing, as we said before, the contemporaries. So if I want to know whether a particular transmitter is accurate, and I want to do a study on that transmitter's accuracy himself, then I have to check, okay, who were his teachers from whom he transmitted? Who were the other scholars who also transmitted from those teachers? And then I should compare their transmissions from that teacher with his transmissions from that teacher and from other teachers. And I will have to see how accurate is his transmissions in relation to their transmissions. And the closer they are to the well-established and renowned transmitters, reliable transmitters, the closer his transmissions are to theirs, the more confident I can be of his accuracy. But if I find that he generally differs to their transmissions, or he transmits it in a different way, or he's the odd one out when it comes to the usage of certain words that don't occur in their transmissions, then I would know that his accuracy is unreliable and Allah knows best. So that's an important point of revision that we have also mentioned earlier on in the first half of the course, but now we proceed bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we said gross mistakes and then غفلته عن الإتقان. But then we moved over to number 5. Sinning. Right? Sinning was the next category. Ibn Hajar mentioned أي فسقه أي بالفعل أو القول. Whether guilty of a physical sin, meaning an action, or an expression. Right? مما لم يبلغ الكفر. But not the type of action or expression that would lead to disbelief. That is, of course, nobody's going to accept it from a disbeliever. وبينه وبين الأول عموما, and there is some overlap between these categories. وإنما أفرد الأول, the reason why he's specifically mentioning the first is لكون القدح به أشد, because being guilty of such a mistake or such a crime is worse في هذا الفن in this subject. A action is going to be considered worse than a statement as long as the statement doesn't reach the point of kufr. وأما الفسق بالمعتقد, as for the type of sin that involves belief, فسيأتي بيانه, we'll explain that in the next lesson because that is referred to as bid'ah, right, or heterodoxy. أو وهمه بأن يروي على سبيل توهم, or if the person is doubtful such that he transmits in a doubtful way. He said this or he said that. This one transmitted to me, or it was that one who transmitted it to me. So that's doubt. So we've covered those in detail in our previous lesson. Walillahi alhamd. So what we'll do now is, inshallah ta'ala, we proceed to the introduction to the next part of the lesson, and then we'll focus in on mukhalaf. So we said we're going to focus in this lesson on mukhalafatihi lithiqat, when a transmitter contradicts those who are known to be reliable. That's number 7. Now we're going to focus in on this, but let's first see the others as well so we can have a broader overview as part of our revision before we commence, inshallah. But bearing in mind the next 3 points are not points that we've learned yet, are not points that we've discussed yet. It forms part of the next lesson. So mukhalafatihi lithiqat, the transmitter going against or contradicting reliable transmitters. The next point is jahalatihi, not knowing the transmitter. There's a mystery about the transmitter. بأن لا يعرف فيه تعديل, such that we don't have anyone giving any sort of verification of this person's integrity. ولا تجريح, nor do we have anyone vilifying or claiming that there's a problem with this person's integrity. معين, no one specifically did this. This person randomly shows up in a chain of transmission once or twice, sometimes only once, sometimes once, twice, thrice, but a few times. So there's not enough information on this person in order to do any sort of muqarana, mu'arada, right? Who you're going to compare him to, because he barely has a contemporary. And none of the people who interact with him in the ahadith, who obviously supposed to know him, none of them give an explicit testimony of this person's integrity or accuracy. So for all intents and purposes, it's just a name in the sanad. And sometimes not even a name in the sanad. So that we'll cover in the next lesson bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's jahalatihi, because he's not known. Number 9. بدعته, when the person is guilty of innovation, وهي اعتقاد ما أحدث على خلاف المعروف عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Bid'ah is in reference to some belief. We refer to it as heterodoxy in English, the antonym of orthodoxy. So اعتقاد, it is belief, it's dogma. ما أحدث على خلاف المعروف, that has been invented or developed against what is known to be representative of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teachings. لا بمعاندة, not necessarily as a means of transgression. It's not deliberately going against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. بل بنوع شبهة. Instead, it is due to some form of some form of ambiguity in the sacred law at the time, some form of ambiguity in an interpretation, right? Authority about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's family, or a particular belief about the Ahlul Bayt, or about a particular belief in Qadr, right? Whether we deny Qadr, whether we believe in coercion, free will, the kalam of Allah. These were early debates in Islam. And as a result, certain groups, right, were built around these beliefs. So how do we deal with transmitters who happen to be part of one of these groups or had some of these heterodox views? So that's what we discuss there. And then finally, number 10, أو سوء حفظه, just downright poor memory. What if a transmitter has poor memory? وهي عبارة, this is an expression, عما يكون غلطه أقل من إصابته. This is the lightest form of problem with the transmitter, where they do make mistakes, but their mistakes are far less or just less than their precisions or their accuracies. So those are the 10 reasons in the form or in the order that is discussed by Ibn Hajar. Now we can focus on mukhalafa, which is again one of the 10, and it is as a whole mukhalafatul rawi lithiqat. When a transmitter is transmitting in a way that contradicts what has been transmitted by those who are already proven to be reliable. So we're trying to make an assessment on this transmitter or on his narrations, but there's a problem because those who had already been assessed as being reliable, their narrations and his narrations don't necessarily match up in one way or the other. So naturally, this can be in a variety of ways. And that's our next task, is to look at the variety of ways. So I'll read from Ibn Hajar's text and I'll translate it immediately. And then we'll look at some explanations as we proceed, and only when necessary, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, bearing in mind that mukhalafa is discussing several things under this broad category. So, ثم المخالفة, then we discuss the problem of contradicting others. إن كانت بتغيير السياق, if it is that it changes the order of the hadith in some form or the other, it changes the meaning and therefore the order and therefore the meaning of the hadith. فمدرج الإسناد, and if it does so, if it changes the wording of the chain, then it is a interpolated chain, mudraj al-isnad. So the one chain supposed to read قال أخبرنا حدثنا, but instead this person uses عن or سمع or a different form, or he inserts words into the chain that does not appear in the chain of those who are more authentic. So there's a mukhalafa, and this type of mukhalafa happens in the chain specifically, so it's called mudrajul isnad. Essentially what it comes down to is he's entered something into the chain or changed some words of the chain that makes it different. أو بدمج موقوف بمرفوع, or he mixes up that which is mawquf, meaning it's attributed to the Sahabi, bimarfu', but he attributes it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or vice versa. Let's say it is a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he stops and attributes it to the Sahabi beneath the Prophet alaihi salatu wasallam, both of which is going to be considered mudrajul matan, where the text, the source of the hadith has been mixed up by the transmitter. The next one, أو بتقديم وتأخير, right? It could also be that the transmitter he presents the last part of the hadith first and the first part of the hadith last, or the last part of a name first and the first part of a name last. This can also be in the isnad and it can also be in the matan. But generally this concept is called al-maqloob, right? When there's a topsy-turvy mixing up of things, al-maqloob. أو بزيادة راوٍ, or you find that in the one chain there is an additional transmitter. So two chains transmit the same thing, right? Obviously we're going to find, let's say if you find the hadith in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba and in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, it doesn't necessarily mean that the two hadith are going to be different entirely. Sometimes the hadith is going to share, naturally they'll share the Prophet ﷺ, they may share the same Sahabi, they may share the same Tabi'i, and then the next person is maybe different because that Tabi'i transmitted to more than one person. So you can use those two ahadith and then you can see the differences between the two. But if, even though they're reporting the same thing, the one hadith in the Muwatta has an additional transmitter than the hadith in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, and this is just a hypothetical example, then you have to discover, so why is there an additional transmitter here? So this concept is known as ziyada. In other words, فالمزيد في متصل الأسانيد, it is an addition في متصل in the contiguous nature of al-asanid, of the chains. So the chain is still contiguous, it's still a connected chain, but there's an additional person therein. Then أو بإبداله ولا مرجحة فالمضطرب وقد يقع الإبدال عمدا امتحانا. Sometimes there's a substitution in the chain. So the basic example of this is that for some reason a scholar changed the name of a rawi to a different name, giving preference to a different isnad. So there was a contradiction in the asanid, and then he changed the name as if saying that this was wrong and that's the right one, so I'm changing the name in this one. But he didn't actually have a reason to prefer that. There was no impetus for him to do so. That is referred to as muttarib. Now that one may sound a bit confusing, so I have additional notes for each case. And let's read the additional notes for this case. I'm not going to read all of the additional notes, it's actually for you. Exchanging one chain for another, while the exchanged chain is not stronger than the original chain. If this is the case, the report is termed al-muttarib or confused. It is to be noted that this confusion can either happen in the chain or the matan. One of the examples of ittirab in matan is the narration mentioned by Imam Tirmidhi, in which it is reported that there are rights of people in your wealth, other than the zakah too. In Sunan Ibn Majah, this narration is mentioned from the same chain. However, the word inna, there is indeed, is replaced by laysa, there is not. This completely changes the meaning of the narration, and the two reports are considered to have ittirab. Accordingly, a deeper study is done by the hadith scholars to identify which of the two is correct and which is a mistake. So that's essentially what ittirab is, and here you can see each one has explanatory notes, but that's for your benefit, inshallah ta'ala. So ittirab is essentially, again, a mix-up of something. It can happen in the sanad, it can happen in the matan, but there's been an exchange of the one for the other and there's no preponderance given. Preponderance meaning there's no evidence that caused the change to be legitimized. So it's a change without valid cause, essentially. We move on to the next one. And believe you me, while as theoretically vague or as abstract as these concepts might be, all that it takes is for an applied study within a primary source of hadith and reading the asanid with an eye of applying these terms to be able to see the value that having these descriptions, which is essentially what they are, the value that they add to one's study. And Allah knows best. Then, أو بتغيير حروف مع بقاء السياق. What happens if there's a change in the huruf? So instead of a ha, there's a kha, instead of a ta, there's a dha, or instead of a qaf, there is a fa, and so on. So these are changes in letters, changes in dots, changes in harakat. but it doesn't change the essential meaning of the hadith. Somehow the meaning is still preserved. This is referred to as a musahhaf from the word suhuf, or muharraf, changed interpolated letters. ولا يجوز تعمد تغيير المتن بالنقص والمرادف إلا لعالم بما يحيل المعاني. Ibn Hajar then says it is not permissible to rely on a changed matan or a deficient word or changing homonyms, right, substituting words. You cannot transmit hadith like that. إلا لعالم, except for a scholar, بما يحيل المعاني, who would know what type of words, what type of expressions would change the meaning. So I've got a note on this as well for your sake. I'm not going to go through it, but just to demonstrate to you, it simply means that it is not permissible to intentionally alter a text by removing a part of it or using synonyms, except for the one who is knowledgeable about what impedes the meaning. That's as straightforward as it gets, and my way of perhaps giving you an example would be that in English, which is the medium that we're using, a person who's a native speaker of the English language would know that certain words have certain nuances, right? So, mathalan, if somebody were to use the word in this day and age and say, you know what, today I woke up and I felt gay. That type of expression, literally, if you say, no, what I meant by I woke up and I felt happy, in this year, in this day and age, to use that expression and refer to a meaning that people no longer use, a person who knows English natively would immediately know that the nuance of that word is inappropriate here. So he would know not to use the word gay and rather to use the word happy, because that would be a more accurate description of what he's trying to say. But if a person is learning English or doesn't know English that well, they just open up the dictionary, find synonyms for the word happy, think that it sounds very nice to use this unique little word, and they use that word and people misunderstand what they mean thereby. I don't know if my example is 100% sound, but if it conveys the meaning to you that you can only change the way you say something if you know what you're doing, then you've understood the concept. So in Arabic, if I want to transmit the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and I don't remember the exact wording that I read in the hadith, can I transmit and say the Prophet ﷺ said and then mention the words? Or would that be a problem? Would that be a sin? Would that be a lie? So the rule is, as long as you're knowledgeable enough not to change the meaning, then it's permissible for you to make substitutions and alterations and convey by meaning. And that's essentially the ruling that Ibn Hajar is mentioning here. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Generally, it is expressed by saying that the person must know Arabic and they must know the rules of grammar and morphology, so that they know what type of changes are permissible and what type of changes are not. فَإِنْ خَفِيَ الْمَعْنَى, if the meaning is hidden, وَاحْتِيجَ إِلَى شَرْحِ الْغَرِيبِ, then, meaning if the hadith contains strange words, rare words, unknown words, then one needs to go to the explanation of gharib words, right? Odd words. The gharib words are not odd words as in they're strange, they're funny words, but rather they are not very utilized. They are not words that people use in their daily language, and even Arabs may not know these words. Sometimes they are words that are no longer utilized at all. But there are special dictionaries and shuruhat or exegetical works specifically elaborating on the meanings of such words. The famous one would be Ibn Athir, right? And I've got a reference to that in the notes for you as well, if you wish to explore that. So he says, then you need to go to these dictionaries, the gharib literature, وَبَيَانِ الْمُشْكِلِ مِنْهَا, and to go and find clarification for the problems that you may find therein. That's the section of text for this lesson. As I said, there are several categories. We looked at each one. There was Mudraj, Al-Maqlub, Al-Mazid fi Muttasil al-Isnad, Al-Muttarib, Musahhaf and Muharraf. Those are the types of mukhalafa where a transmitter contradicts more reliable transmitters. Then there's a note for each concept. I've explained it already. This is for your reference and for your study bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. As long as you've understood what we've covered, that's fine. Here's the note about Ibn Athir's work, An-Nihaya fi Gharib al-Hadith wal-Athar. So you can refer to such works if you so desire to expand your knowledge about hadith. And I leave you with this question, inshallah. A transmitter, a rawi, can be weak due to a problem with his what or his what. Meaning there's only two broad categories why a transmitter can be weak. It's either because of a problem with his or it's a problem with his. And I would like you to know those answers based on the lesson. And you'll also find similar opportunities to test your knowledge in the quiz bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So do make sure that you follow through after the lesson, that you follow through by reading the notes, that you test your knowledge with the quiz. It's for your benefit, inshallah ta'ala. And do engage with me in the forums, because that is how we learn. Ilm is not just this me sitting on this one side and saying things. You have to think about it. You have to, engage the material. Did you understand it? Do you have any issues with anything? Do you need clarification? Have you seen a different perspective perhaps that you wish to share with others? Pick the brains of our fellow students, bi-idhnillah. All welcome, and I hope to see you all there. Jazakumullah khairan. Until next time, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Subhanallahi wa bihamdi. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
La ilaha illallah.